So I want to go through a case study, a UCD case study around multiple means of action and expression. And this is a case study project, I suppose, that we did a few years ago in UCD. So what the project was a project, it was called inclusive assessment, but in essence what it was about was allowing all students in a class to have a choice of assessments within a module. So we had about 9 modules that were involved in the project. Different staff from across different disciplines, and they worked with me to design their modules that allowed a choice for all. So it wasn't that there was a choice for certain students, it was any student in their module could pick either or of the assessments, and they had that choice. So in this particular project we had 2 choices, and I'll come back to that and how well that worked, but we thought we'd start with 2 choices. So they could choose option A or option B, as for whatever reason that they wanted, they had that choice. We did write this up. The slide, the resource on the left there, Practitioner's Guide, goes through the details of all the particular modules, written by the module coordinators, and it describes the modules and how they went. And the other article there on the right was one that I wrote myself there more recently that presented the more research on this piece. So there's 2 particular resources here that you might like to see if you want to see how to do this in more detail. But I'll go through the steps that we did to actually implement this choice, and these steps we would recommend if you're thinking of doing this. So there were 7 steps. First of all, this might not be for all modules. There may be modules that, for example, you need to have a particular form of assessment because of a competency. So it may not be for every module. So the first thing is to consider which module it might be useful for. And you might consider in particular, are there modules that have a lot of diverse students? And many of the modules on this particular case studies had some diverse. Sometimes it was diverse because it was a module that spanned a final year and a master's course. So some had students who were working and some students weren't working, and it was that diversity. Others had more international students, and others had students from different socioeconomic backgrounds. So a lot of them had diverse student cohorts, and the diversities were quite diverse. The second step is to consider the choice. It is good to maybe pick different choices, so not choices that are very close, to have some sort of diversity in that choice so the students can play to stronger and different strengths. There is a process involved in developing equity between the choices, but I'll come back to that. Then you need to make the expectations explicit. You have to be very clear to the students what the different types are. You then implement it. You need to support the process. And the final step is to evaluate and adjust. So as you learn about it, that you adjust it maybe for the following year. So there were 7 steps to the process. I want to revisit the equity thing. One of the issues that people talk about in choice, and indeed they talk about it sometimes when there's a special accommodations, is are the assessments fair? Do the students feel that there's a fairness with the different types? And how do you ensure that you are not advantaging some students over the other? So one of the processes that we developed for this particular project was what we called an equity template. And basically it was a template, as it says, that had the 2 options. So down the left-hand column there were different criteria, and then you had option A and option B. And for each of the options, for the 2 types of assessment methods, you need to, as staff, if you are doing this, fill in this template and explain, first of all, why it might suit the students. So if you are using, say, for example, a poster versus an oral presentation, why a poster might suit students. So you might write it, if you want to choose a poster, remember that you might need to be able to design a poster. You have to talk about it in this way. If you're doing a presentation, you need to be able to use a PowerPoint. You need to be able to present in this way. So you are making sure it's very clear to the students what they have to do and why it might suit them. We also, in this template, explain the assessment criteria. The criteria needs to be relatively similar, but there might be 1 or 2 that differ. And the students just need to know that. So there might be slightly different criteria for the poster, for example. So it might be more might be stronger on how they answered questions in the conversation versus how they presented in the other one. So there might be slightly difference, but once the students know it and once it's very clear, it's important. Another thing was showing how there was equity in marking and feedback, where they're similar, and it doesn't have to be the same. So equity is not the same, doesn't mean that everything has to be the same, it just has to be equitable. And the students need to know that it's fair. So what were the marking procedures and feedback here? And are they slightly different but equitable here? Then the last kind of criteria was equitable in workload and teaching and learning approaches. So the workload might be different, but it has to be relatively similar in amount. What they do might be slightly different, but it needs to be equitable. The purposes of this equity template were twofold. First of all, it made staff design in an equitable way, but it also allowed students to see beforehand why it made it an informed choice. So it gave the description of the two types and it made an informed choice. The other thing that made it an informed choice is that if there was unfamiliar assessments, for example, maybe some students hadn't seen a poster presentation before, we made examples available to them beforehand. So the modules that were done were a variety of modules across UCD. Development and Advanced Pharmacology was third year students, Ecological and Environmental Biology were third year students, Human Rights and Law, and then they repeated it the following year. So there was 3 modules there, and then there's a repeat of those 3 modules. And then there was Computer Science Data Mining, which was for master students, Making of Early Modern France, that were first year students, and the Medical Research Elective that were medical students. So we investigated it after the staff had done it and the students had done the work, we actually interviewed the staff and we sent a student questionnaire. And what we found with the choice of assessment project was there was a couple of reasons why students chose the different assessment methods, and this in itself was interesting. Interestingly, the most common, which is the one at the bottom there in this graph, is the timing of it suited my organisation skills. So some of them had, the projects had actually more organised structure, and a lot of students went for it because of that, which is interesting in itself. Many choose the assessment because they felt they could do well on it. They could play to their strengths, which there's 2 different, this comes through allowed to show strengths, could do well on it. But interestingly, and I found this particularly interesting, was quite a few of them, over 40%, said that they wanted to try something different. And I think that's something new, that students didn't always go for the easy option, didn't always go for the one that they thought they would shine at. Sometimes they just wanted to try something different, which I think is something we learned from it. This graph here is a graph that shows, it's a box plot, but it shows the box in the middle shows where most of the student scores were when they were asked to rate it between 1 and 5. So how positive were they towards this form of assessment? And this graph shows that most of the data clumped around sort of 3.5 to 4, but some going as high as 5. So a lot of it was, students were very positive about having choice and being allowed to have some choice. Interestingly, the postgrad students were even a little more positive than undergraduate. Again, I think that's sometimes to do with, taking choices is not always an easy thing to do if you haven't experienced. So it was very positive. The students were very positive about it. And some of the quotes that they said were, I struggle with calculations sometimes, so I thought the essay would give me a better chance to show my strengths. Now, obviously, if calculations was a competency in this particular case you couldn't have done it, and this is where it's important, the choice of module to use these in. But this student talked about being allowed to show some strengths. And this one here is, as a student who is dyslexic, I appreciate the flexibility in assessment. Too much of a focus on an essay format, it allowed me to be more academically expressive. Going back to the idea of action and expression, and there's a student where the essay format did not suit her or him. The other one I thought that was very interesting is we got quotes from the students that said, personally, I prefer the exam. So obviously they chose the exam when there was a choice. And another student says, I don't do well under exam circumstances. So this choice allowed these competing diversities, and I thought that was a really nice kind of part of it. In relation to the staff one of the quotes was, "I'm now considering that it's possible that you can talk about theory. It doesn't always have to be in the written format all the time. We have, in the past, exclusively assessed by written work." So this allowed, obviously this choice allowed students to talk about the theory as opposed to always writing about the theory. And again, this quote alluded to the fact that exclusively assessed by written work. And that doesn't mean that they never have to do written work, but maybe not all the time. So in conclusion, it was very positively received by students and staff. Interestingly, when asked about number of assessments, they felt 2 assessment choices was enough. More hidden diversities were accommodated. Some of the things that came through, I do remember one quote where one student said, "I picked that option because I commute from Galway." So obviously there was one option where you had to be on campus more versus another, and that allowed a student who was living further away from campus. Postgraduate students, most positive to the assessment choice. It has potential to reduce some special accommodations because as they're being more accommodated, they may not need special accommodations. And it aligns obviously with the Universal Design for Learning principles.